I often see questions that I'd like to answer but get sad when I see that it already has 1000 plus comments. Can I read your stories that you've wanted to tell but got buried instead? Had been working late, till 11 PM, and was walking to a friend's place for an all-night movie night. It was dark and freezing cold. I had to be careful as it had rained earlier that evening, and there was hard to see ice here and there. When crossing a pedestrian bridge, I saw a man laying unconscious in the stairs with his head downwards and feet up. I took a closer look to check if he was okay, or as okay as one can be after presumably falling in stairs. Turns out he had cracked his skull and there were lots of blood, but he was breathing. I called an ambulance and tried to wake him up. He came to after a couple of minutes, and I helped him sit up, then lay down in a better position. He looked at me and tried to speak, but he could only let out some quiet mumbling gurgling sounds. He tried to touch his head a couple of times, but I stopped him and tried to explain to him what had happened. He was very disorientated and could only respond with incomprehensible mumbling and hand gestures. I sat down and held him company until the ambulance came, which took about 15 minutes. We communicated mostly with looks and hand gestures. When the ambulance finally came, I explained the situation and watched them take care of him. Then I went home to my friend. I went directly to the bathroom and washed away all blood, then told him what had happened. Almost a year later, I was sitting on a tram when the man from earlier came and sat down in the seat next to me. He had a thick foreign accent and limited vocabulary, but he shook my hand, hugged me and told me I was a good man. Then he tried to tell me his life story, but unfortunately I had a hard time understanding his accent. A few stops later, he stood up to get off the tram. Once again he hugged me and told me I was a good man. Then he walked away while looking back at me with a very happy smile on his face. One time, at Target, I was paying for my crap and the cashier held out his hand to give me change. I thought he was offering to fist bump me. Happens more than you think. I thought my explanation to a 5-year-old of how air conditioning works was really good, but I showed up too late to the game for anyone to notice. Sadly, I've probably showed up too late to this party as well. Air and water are both examples of fluids. A fluid is something that flows, and there are two easy ways to make fluids cold. The first is to force the fluid into as small of a space as you can, called compression, and then release it into a big space, called expansion. Experiment. Open your mouth and blow on the back of your hand like you're making an H sound. Notice how hot it feels. That's because the air you're blowing is just as hot as your body. Now make your mouth into an O like you're going to whistle. Put your hand a couple inches from your mouth and blow on the back of your hand again. It should be cooler this time. That's because you compressed the air up against your lips and then it got cold once it passed your lips and expanded. The second way we can make a fluid cold is by letting it turn from a liquid, like water, into a gas, like water vapor or air. This is called evaporation. Experiment. Lick the back of your hand, and then blow on it again like you're whistling. It feels cold, doesn't it? Even cooler than before? That's because you are now combining compression, as you force the air through your lips, followed by expansion, as the air is released onto your hand, followed by evaporation, as the air you're blowing causes the saliva on your hand to turn to vapor. Air conditioners work by combining these two methods of cooling fluids, but instead of air or water, they use refrigerant. What's refrigerant? It's just a fluid that gets really cold when you compress it, expand it and let it evaporate. So here's how your AC works. 1. The refrigerant starts as a warm gas and it goes through a compressor and a condenser. The condenser is just a long winding tube with a fan blowing on it that helps convert the gas to a liquid, and out comes really compressed warm liquid. All of this takes place in your outdoors unit. That's why you feel hot air blowing out of it. 2. This warm liquid passes into your house through an expansion valve, which acts like your O-shaped lips, and an evaporator and turns into a cold gas. The evaporator, like the condenser, is just a long winding tube with a fan blowing on it. 3. Then the fan blows on the evaporator and takes the warm air from your house and turns it into the cool air that you'll feel coming from the vents. 4. The warmth from the air in your house turns the cold gas back into a warm gas and the process starts all over. Incredibly well explained. I've honestly always wondered. This was regarding a call I ran at EMS. It was significant to me since out of the thousands of calls I've run, only a handful have bothered me. This was one of them. I responded to an apparent overdose to find police restraining a combative male who had attempted suicide. On the way to his room in the back of the house, I saw blood stains on the carpet, not uncommon, along with what I thought was broken pottery. When I made contact with the OD, I see a deputy cuffing him and notice that, while he has a few scratches, it's not nearly enough to justify the amount of blood in the hall. I go back out for a second look and notice that what I thought was broken pottery is actually bone fragments with small amounts of tissue attached. Along with the blood, these fragments form a now obvious trail to a closed door in the hall. I follow the trail to the door, which opens directly into a staircase. In addition to the floor, the staircase wall had blood smears along it. I take the staircase down into the basement, which has a broken light. Being on night shift, I always carry a really good flashlight, which seemed as dim as a match this evening. I follow the blood trail through the basement, which is stacked high with clutter. Around several turns, I find myself underneath the staircase I just came down. Carelessly stuffed under the stairs is the bludgeoned body of a young woman whose head had been reduced to a pulp by a hammer, also discarded nearby. Da frick. The street my apartment is on has free parking along one side, and by nightfall the street is filled with cars, bumper to bumper. I'm driving home one night and out from between two of the cars comes a basketball, followed by, to my horror, a dude, right into the road. I slammed on my brakes, was only going about 25, but could not fully stop, and I sort of bumped him. He goes rolling, and I'm in such shock I can't even move. Holy crap. I just hit someone with my car. He gets up, going I'm okay, I'm not hurt. It's okay Hugh. Coming from the other direction is a car, who pulls over. Out steps a police officer. Crap, he saw the whole thing. He talks to the guy. Turns out the guy is flat tanked, too drunk to look into the street before jumping after his ball. He arrests the drunk guy, then takes down my information. He says look, I witnessed the whole thing. You were not at fault for this. If the guy tries to get money from you, you're safe. The whole time, the guy's drunk friends were watching from the apartment stoop. So that's the story of how I hit a guy with my car and got him arrested for it. There was a thread about smart things dogs, and other pets I guess, but most of the posts were about dogs. But I was a bit late to the party, so I didn't have the chance to post this. My brother had a small child, maybe 1-2 years old, it's hard to remember, and there were some of her toys laying on the floor. Our dog, a Tibetan Spaniel Poodle mix, kept stealing the toys despite having some of her own, but we always said no and took the toys away. A bit later she didn't actually steal the toys anymore, but took them and left one of her own toys to replace it. TLDR. My dog is a business genius. My parents had a couple Lhasa Apsos and a golden retriever. If one of the other dogs was chewing something she wanted, the female Lhasa would go to the door, asking to be let out. Once the door was opened, the other two would rush out the door and she would casually turn around, walk over, and plop down with the toy bone. Not bright dogs, but this was excellent. When my younger brother and I were toddlers, he was 1, I was 4. We used to take baths together. I had a favorite sponge that I would use to squeeze water over my brother's head. So one night we're in the tub and I grab the sponge and squeeze it over my brother's head and it splits in half in my hand. It was my brother's poop. True story. I posted this in a thread a day late. Glad I can still share it. When I was about 8, my parents brought me and my younger sister to Disney World, Florida. Fun right? We go to this really cool exhibit Turtle Talk with Crush, where you can talk to that turtle, Crush, from Finding Nemo. Basically there is a huge screen at the front of a dark room where animated Crush answers questions and does a show. But anyway, I was absolutely starstruck. Crush the turtle, and I can talk to him? Amazing. When we get there, we wait a while until he asks the question. So dudes, what is your favorite food? My hand shoots up. It's my chance. My moment. He says, yo, little dude in the pink shirt, what's your favorite food? I rack my brain. What do you like to eat? What is your absolute favorite food? My answer becomes one I will always regret. Tuna. The room goes absolute silent. All the other kids in the room just stare at me with their jaws dropped. I turn to my dad and go, "What?" Needless to say, Crush responds by swimming behind a virtual rock in his screen. He hides there for about a minute until he peeks out to say, "Is she gone?" Worst day of my childhood, even though it has now become my family's favorite embarrassing kid story about me. TLDR. Crush the turtle hates me. Could also have said turtle soup like a boss. I posted this a while ago and absolutely nobody read it, but I thought it was really endearing, so I'll go ahead and share it here. I know this story probably won't get seen by many, but it's too cute not to share anyway. When I was in 5th grade I was living on an Air Force base in Japan. The war in Iraq had just started, so a lot of the parents were getting shipped off. My parents, being regular government workers, didn't have to go, so I thankfully never had to worry about it. One day our assignment was to write letters back to the kindergarten kids who had written to Santa. Pretty much all of the kids wrote lists like "I want a Barbie and a nail polish set etc etc. But mine was different, and I remember it distinctly. "Dear Santa, my daddy has been away in Iraq for a long time and all I want is for him to be home for Christmas this year. I love him and I miss him very much. Love, Jimmy." Last name. My heart pretty much melted. I wrote back something to the effect that Santa mainly makes toys, but he will give some extra consideration and see if he can make it happen. No promises, though, because I had no idea if his dad was going to be home or not. When I went home that day I told my mom all about the letter. I mentioned his name and she goes, "Wait, say his name again." Turns out she actually knew his father, and he had just gotten back from deployment. So I went to the teacher and got a copy of the letter and my mom went to go give it to him. She said he had tears in his eyes when he read it. Best part, he was home for Christmas that year. Why can't I hold all these feels? There was a thread about a month ago that was farmers of Reddit. What is one misconception about your job, or something along those lines. I had the perfect joke, but it was way too late to use. A head of lettuce is not a job title. You shouldn't judge the head of lettuce. There isn't much room for a promotion and he doesn't want to take a salary cut. I'm sitting in a taxi, stopped at a signal, just looking around casually when I notice a small kid in the car alongside staring at me like he can't believe what he's seeing. His window's up and the traffic is noisy, so I can't hear anything he's saying, but he's clearly excited because he's pointing at me and asking his parents, or whoever was in the front seat of the car, to look at me as well. His mom on their passenger's side looks at me, opens her eyes wide for a sec, then shushes her kid. From what I can make out, she's shaking her head and saying no and asking the kid to settle down. I'm a bit curious by this time and decide to tap their window and say, "Hey, so what was that all about?" Mum was clearly caught off guard by my knocking on her window and she was convinced I'd anyway heard what her son was shouting. So when she opens her window, the first thing she says is, "I'm sorry about my son. He thought you were the girl from one of his dad's porn." She spelled it. Movies he accidentally saw the DVD cover of. We told him it was an Explorer movie, like the ones we sometimes let him see on Discovery. That's why he kept saying that's the lady with no clothes on. I can only see the back of Dad's head, but his ears are red and his neck is unnaturally stiff. Hopefully, the only part of him that is right then, and he's looking straight ahead. An awkward exchange of giggles, smiles and kids apparently I look the same with clothes on. Haha, just kidding. And a quick putting up of windows on both our sides later. The light turned green and we each sped on our respective different ways. TLDR. Was mistaken for a P actress by 5-year-old kid. Take it as a compliment. LOL. My dad is a photographer and one night he was called, really late, by someone from Universal Pictures. They were filming in the name of the father and needed a photographic prop, and they had found him in the yellow pages. This was pre-Photoshop, so turning a photo of an actor into something which looked like a police mugshot was actually quite a big job. Involved taking photos of photos etc, and he was one of the only people who could do the necessary photographic work and also print it out quickly because he had a 1-hour photo machine. Because it was a big job and they wanted it done in 12 hours, he quoted them £500. Also, he didn't really want to do it because it was a pain in the ass tricky job, which they accepted. So he did the work and they sent round a guy in a big car with blacked out windows to our house to pick it up. When the guy arrived he didn't want to pay the money my dad had quoted and pulled a whole "we'll pay this much and you'll like it," so my dad said fine, I'd rather burn it then, at which point they buckled, paid the money they promised and left him with the threat that he would never work for Universal again. You can imagine the size of the frick he gave about that. TLDR. Universal blacklisted my dad after trying to stiff him on payment for a job. I almost pooped my pants in the middle of a college lecture and started to cry because I couldn't find a bathroom. No joke, and it's still one of the most horrific, panicked moments of my life. I thought it was just a fart so I held it in. Later during the lecture I had these absolutely appalling guttural noises coming from my stomach. I started to panic, obviously, and I ran out the door. I went to the first restroom I could find but all the stalls were in use except a urinal. I started to reach code red at this point, as I could barely walk and hold in my mastodon-like dump. I started to cry thinking to myself I'm 20 years old and I'm about to poop my pants like a kindergartner. Right as I was about to leave the bathroom I heard a glorious flush come from a stall and I ran into it and blew butt everywhere. I didn't even try to be polite. My butt literally shook the walls. When I was 18 my parents got divorced. My father was miserable and we barely spoke. I blamed him for the divorce and when he left I had no interest in trying to keep a relationship with him. For several years we did not hear from him. Then he decided to try and reconnect with us. It was awkward. We were never very close and the conversation was uncomfortable. A few lunches in I figured he would give up but he persisted. To help things along I started playing a game. During the week I would make mental reminders of interesting news stories to discuss. It became quite fun trying to determine which stories would be effective conversation starters and we discovered some shared interests. It was such a success that we soon became fast friends. I would look forward to our weekly lunches with my list of news items. We would yell and scream at each other in wonderfully exaggerated debates and laugh, laugh, laugh. When I broke up with my girlfriend he offered an extra room to me, free, if I would teach him how to use the internet. He became my best friend and I started to understand why he was so miserable with my mother. He never said it in so many words but I could see their incompatibilities when I started to really learn who he was. A few years later he passed away, lung cancer. I miss him terribly, and even now, 6 years later I find myself dreaming of him and our hearty conversations. But the most wonderful part is that I still log stories for him. It's never really conscious. I just hear a story and instantly put it away to save until our next conversation. It helps me during the wait until I see him again even though I, like him, don't believe our paths will cross. I was swimming at my, then, apartment's pool. It wasn't very big, but it was somewhat deep. Two kids come in 5 and 9, with mother, who is on the phone the whole time. Even the whole time this story takes place. The 9-year-old jumps right in the deep end, but the 5-year-old must stay on the steps in the shallow end. He's way too short, and isn't good at swimming. These were mom's words, as she walked out of the gated area leaving them with me. I chilled in the deep end, and the 9-year-old tried to splash me, and I let him have heck. It escalated quickly. It was fun. Meanwhile, 5-year-old decides we're having too much fun. He takes one step past the last step. Instantly he falls in the water above his head. At first, I didn't think much of it. He'll come up paddling any moment I said to myself. And while this is happening the 9-year-old is still playing. He doesn't even notice. I tilt my head to the side while still splashing the other. I stared very intently. Too much time went by. Immediately I went underwater and kicked off the back wall with as much force as I possibly could. I just remember thinking this kid is dead. I was adrenaline heavy. It might be the fastest I've ever swam. I do so occasionally, probably more than most, but I'm not Michael Phelps. I feel my fingers touch his chest and I immediately wrap my arms around and thrust my body upward. He is so incredibly light that when we get to the top I'm just holding his entire body over the water. I look him in the face and I swear he was blue. I think the force of me pulling him out helped him, because suddenly I see his eyes open. He coughs, and then hurls huge freaking chunks of vomit all over me and the water. He coughs so more. Mom comes running, still on the mother freaking phone, grabs him from me, tells the other kid to get out of the water, and leaves, still on the phone, still on the phone, still on the freaking phone. I duck my head underwater, swim to the other side and hoist my way out. I dry off and tell the office attendant what happened. She was young and started dialing 911, but I stop her and tell her she needs to call a pool cleaner instead. To this day I wonder if that mother knew I saved her kid's life or if she thought I was screwing around with him in the shallow end. I'll never know, and this will never be seen. Not a chance in heck. This Reddit thread lived long enough to become the villain. Alright, backstory. I moved to Michigan from Long Island this past September, and I haven't seen anyone from New York since I moved, and I was pretty involved in the local music scene. So I was friends with a band who decided to do a tour of the Great Lakes, specifically so they could see me. But to the story, Eli Whitney and the Sound Machine are a ska band composing of 5 members. 4 guys and a girl. They're all in relationships except for the lead singer, so since they were coming out to see me, I figured I'd hook up the lead singer with a single friend of mine here. Least I could do as a host. They play a great set, and there's chemistry between the two, so after the set, he gets a BJ from her in the tour van. This is where things get bad. She doesn't swallow, but in fact spits it out into her hand and throws it out the window. Now that's not the bad part. The bad part is that some of it landed on the girl member of the band's sleeping bag. She finds out and freaks out on the lead singer and punches him in the back. Things should be alright now. I mean, she hit him, so next morning when they leave for the next tour stop, he rides with the other touring band, and the 2 members make up before the next show and play a decent set. After the show, they decide to go to a sporting goods store, and the girl member sees sleeping bags and goes ballistic, threatening to beat the crap out of the guy again, and she gets yelled at by the other band members, and she just snaps into a panic attack. She cries hysterically, tries to rip the bark off a tree and flings her fanny pack into the air. The other bandmates are worried about her, so they take her to a hospital, and she gets plane tickets to fly back to New York the next morning. She writes on Tumblr that she quits the band and their actions led to her demise. Since she says she quit and she's gone crazy, they decide to change the band's Facebook's passwords and write her out, which when she sees, she decides to slander them all and tells them in a blog post, "Good luck trying to find a gig on Long Island again," and actively gets people to unlike their band page. TLDR. I broke a band up by getting someone a BJ. Spitters are always ruining lives, but hooray for ska. I used to work at an expensive steakhouse and one night, one of our VIPs brought in Bruce Willis. They're in a back room and Bruce comes out and asks me where the bathroom is. I jokingly said what? Die Hard can't find the bathroom. Didn't come out quite as douchy as it sounds. Without missing a beat, Bruce goes, "If it makes you feel any better, I'm going to blow it up once I get in there." Ha ha ha. Oh crap. My heart wills this to be true. Well, back in the 6th grade my family ordered a large box of steak. Once the steak arrived I soon noticed that dry ice was used to keep the food from going bad. So what better to do than make some dry ice bombs? My brother and I take some dry ice and shove it into some plastic bottle and close the lid. We set the bomb down and run away. After about 10-15 minutes one of my neighbors was getting antsy, so he decided to pick up the dry ice bomb and chuck it at the ground. Somehow it still didn't explode. My 6th grade brain told me that it would be a really good idea to try that again and make the bomb go off. I then picked up the dry ice bomb and was cocking my arm back to throw it, when, boom, it explodes right in my hand that happens to be next to my right ear. Plastic shrapnel is going everywhere and my hand hurts like a bee. Plus I couldn't hear much in my right ear besides a persistent ringing. I got myself checked out and luckily nothing permanent or terrible had happened. But it sure does give a fun story to tell. I've told this before but I'll tell it again. I was playing Xbox with my brother one day and we were sitting on those fold up chairs you sometimes see in wrestling. It was his turn to play and I got bored sitting there and watching, so I got up and put my head through the hole where the backrest is so my torso was laying on the butt seat. He was playing and I leant forward and the entire chair started to lean forward. It started to fold up with me in it and I had my arms trapped by my sides so I couldn't save myself. I fell forward and hit my forehead very hard against the floor and knocked myself out. When I came round my brother was just sitting there laughing at me whilst I was squashing my head into the floor because the weight of my torso was still making the chair fold up. It's painful to relive. This is my late to the party weird roommate thread post. I was at an activity camp as part of a school trip. Everyone was sleeping in big, 10-person tents so big they had bunk beds inside. As with most school trips, they had inspections to see how tidy every tent was. Our tent was a mess, and we found out there was an inspection due in 5 minutes. There was only myself and one other girl there. No one else could be found, so we tried to tidy up as best we could. Our strategy was, if anything was on near anyone's bed, we'd hide it under their covers so nobody's stuff was lost. I was hurriedly putting something that had been next to my best friend's bed away, and there, under her pillow, was a hamburger. We'd had hamburgers for lunch the day before. It wasn't even wrapped, just flattened, under her pillow. And the first sign of an eating disorder is, last year on the 11th of May, I drove home from my university all the way across Texas. It's a really long drive and I'm usually exhausted by the end of it. My street in my hometown makes a big U-shape so I can access it from 2 intersections. As I drove down the main road, I saw dozens of ambulances and cop cars all over one of these intersections. My skin began to crawl because I knew it was someone I cared about. No, it wasn't my family. No, not any of my friends. My sister's friend. I decided something awful must have happened to someone my sister knows. I'd find out when I got home. I was just down the road. Well, no one was at home. Do I stay here and wait or do I walk down there and see what's going on? No, I stayed there and waited, and waited. And finally it started getting dark so I called my mum. She was out at a dance team gala for my sister, so they must not know what's going on. So I made myself food but I couldn't eat and I got a call from my dad. He said that my sister's boyfriend, who lives all the way across town, shot himself in the head at the end of our street and that my mum was keeping my sister away until it was cleaned up. My sister's boyfriend had the potential to be a force of nature. He was incredibly smart. He was charming, hilarious, and brave. We'd adored him for years and took him on vacation with us and he basically lived with us when his parents divorced and moved away and didn't want to take responsibility for him. He had a drug problem, though, and a lot of psychological problems from abuse and neglect. He stole my mum's debit card information and stole $12,000 from us that we never got back because we didn't want him to go to jail. After that she was not allowed to see him. He wasn't allowed over, and he spent the last Christmas alone because his family all went out of state and my mum wouldn't let him stay with us. It was a horrible time and I always hoped and even prayed, I am an atheist, that he'd get the help he needed. Just as I got off the phone, my mum pulled into the driveway and I watched my sister break down next to the car. The most hideous mixture of guilt and loss hit me like a train as the shock wore off. Of the thousands of streets and the billions of people, he chose our street and thought about us before he killed himself. I lent a girl my brother's copy of Forrest Gump. He was 23 when this happened, me 15. Inside said copy of Forrest Gump was in fact another film. This film was called Luscious Boobs 2. I lent a girl a porno she proceeded to tell and show all of her friends in school about. Technology being the way it is, my entire school year found out before the day ended, and rumors being exaggerated the way they are. Everyone thought it was a porno of Forrest Gump. Several people came up to me going Jenny, oh Jenny and harder Forrest, harder. My 2 best friends still remind me of this by saying, hey Degrish, Luscious Boobs 2, the sequel's always better. That's the second time I've told that story on Reddit. TL. DR. Lent a girl a porno, in a copy of Forrest Gump. Oh Jenny, oh hi Jenny. Submitted this in a what's the creepiest true story you've ever heard thread. The story is just crazy enough that I wished more people could have seen it. This one is a little more intense than spooky. A little backstory first. My father is older. I'm 25, he's 80, but still strong-bodied and sound of mind. He's lived a life of hard work, so he pays no mind to ghosts or aliens or Bigfoot or anything like that. A few years ago, he was hauling a few £1,000s of aluminum from Phoenix to somewhere in California with a friend. They had to use 2 vehicles with trailers because they didn't have access to anything larger at the time. The trip to California went fine. They unloaded, got their cash and started to head back. Around 9 or 10 PM they had made it about 20 minutes east of Seligman, a small town located about where the 66 and 40 meet. and decided to stop for a few hours on the side of the road to get some rest. His friend had already gone to sleep in the truck behind my dad's. My dad had made his way to the back of his truck where his cooler was to grab a drink and a quick bite to eat before he went to bed. As he was making a sandwich, he noticed something in the sky, to the north of him traveling from east to west. He watched it, but paid no mind to it until it veered off course and started heading his direction, descending sharply. The closer it got, the bigger it got. As it reached the ground, it bounced and cut into the earth sharply, but still headed in my dad's direction. As it grew closer he could clearly make out what it was. His description was a huge disc-shaped craft that spun like a gyro. It had a glowing center. The craft itself didn't make a sound, save for the sound of crashing into the earth. At this point, my dad was frozen in awe and fear. He had no idea what to do. The craft was around 100 yards out when another craft of the same type came flying from behind my dad's view and met the other craft. The flying craft extended what my dad described as a kind of tether to the crashed craft. After a few moments, the flying craft kicked on a second engine of some kind. My dad described it as the most powerful engine he's ever heard. The flying craft picked up the crashed one, and with those engines active, they both flew out of view within 3 seconds. My dad told this story to me about a week after it happened. As he told it, his hands shook. Whatever he saw scared the living heck out of him. He even tried to inform local news agencies about what happened, but of course, was hung up on. Recently there was a story accusing Wells Fargo of firing an employee to avoid having to support his daughter that was recently diagnosed with cancer. I worked for Wells for 2.5 years. I have a cancer that requires a cutting-edge and expensive chemotherapy drug to keep me in remission. I also have type 1 diabetes. My job was never in danger even though I was certainly a financial burden for the company. Your health system is freaking barbaric. Okay, here goes. I'm a typical guy. I don't have any weird quirks or anything, except this one thing I do, and it has to do with Reddit. You see, when most people want to use a throwaway, they just create some BS account for a one-time use. Hence the name Throwaway, right? Well, not me. What I do is different, extraordinary, weird, fricked up, or downright magical. Call it what you will. What I do is that I create my throwaway before I ever even need to use it. Like I might create one today and never need to use it until 2014. But that's not all, folks. From the time I create that account until I use it, I turn it into somebody else. But now you're probably thinking, why golly, Cheesinator, what could you ever mean by that? Well, I'll tell you. I create personalities for them. I make up their own distinctive writing style, as well as their own backstory, where they came from, who they are, etc. I then regularly go and Reddit with them, implementing their backstory into the realms of Reddit, so that should anybody ever think that the throwaway finale is me, they are proved wrong. All in the hope that if I ever need to use it, I can't be recognized. I might have anywhere from 5-10 of these accounts at a time, and after I use them, I still update them for a couple of weeks before terminating their use. It's not that I'm paranoid or anything, it's just I feel a bit more safe if I do this. Now, these personalities I make for these people are quite elaborate, and each differs greatly from my actual life, to set in stone that they aren't me. So, the next time you see a story that is weird enough to be used with a throwaway, but isn't, think to yourself, is that Cheesinator? But then again, am I really who you think I am? Oh dear god, now there are only a few people on Reddit. Joke seems more plausible. This is gonna get buried, but who cares? My dad found Charlie Sheen stealing beer from his limo with a couple other guys. When my father asked, is that Charlie Sheen, he responded that they were the Jackson 5, handed my father a 20, then left with the beer. Mind you, this was back in the 80s. Me and my friend's goal for this summer is to tag Alaska's 10 largest cities in 10 different places with the words "have more adventures." We've been to 4 out of 10 so far, and it's going swimmingly. We also decided that we'll do this wherever we live and send each other pictures of it. It sounds lame, but I hope it makes someone smile, and maybe gives them the push to do something new. Reading this thread is like Reddit Russian roulette. I never know if the story will make me laugh, sob, or cringe in disgust. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.